How to be more convincing and more persuasive when you tell stories and when you use storytelling into your practice or into your daily life. The thing with stories is that everybody knows this person who is highly charismatic, and no matter what he says, everybody listens. You may not be like that. For example, when I am at a dinner table, if I am at a family dinner, when I tell a story, everybody shuts up. That's me. I was already on stage at 15 years old. Not everybody is that used to capture attention. For people who don't have that, I wouldn't recommend to engage into massive theatrical gestures and movements and eye contact and big theatrical with your voice. If it is not your natural personality, don't force yourself. There are other ways to capture attention if you want people to pay attention and listen, and if you want your message to be much more convincing. The first technique is to always, basically all of those techniques are about connecting their inner experience with the story you are telling. So the first technique is to start using the actual words or the actual name of the person you are trying to convince or persuade. If you use the exact words, especially the hot value words that they are using, so if they have a fight about legalizing cannabis, for example, just an example among many. If people have a fight, a deeply rooted fight into their head about this, and if you don't really care about it, but if you mention this actual legalization term, they are going to pay attention much more, because now you just used one word they had a strong emotional effect with. So for example, for the context of somebody being a coach or somebody wanting to help people in therapy, for example, let's say this is John. John is the client here. John says, I could never face conflicts with my parents. It was always impossible, they were never letting me speak, stuff like that. In that case, the leading metaphor, some story you might say, and you want him to really pay attention and you want your message to really go straight into his unconscious mind, you may say, one time I met a kid named Richard who had learned an incredible way to face conflicts with anyone because he had read some book. Would you like me to tell you what was written inside the book? And there you have just used the term face conflicts. It was the same thing John said that he was never able to do with his parents right here in this context. You just want to reuse the things people say, because the more of their words you use to persuade them, the least likely they will to resist. The second technique is to make people shut up, more specifically inside their own head, when they constantly talk to themselves and you try to get their attention, but they are like this, and they don't even listen at some point. You just discover that when you become better with calibration skills, when you become more accurate and aware of their body language. Some people have like some small movements around the lips that is just indicating some inner dialogue, and when they do that, if it is just a few seconds, they may be processing what you say, but if they are constantly like this as you speak and they have like a dead look, it is just meaning they are not listening, or they just don't care about what you say. In that case, one very useful language pattern I have used to make them shut up inside their own head is to say, most likely if this is into a disagreement or into a verbal conflict, something they are disagreeing with you about, you might say, you know what, I used to think like that before, and one day I discovered one thing that completely made me change my mind. So you are pacing and leading, you are pacing, telling them, yeah, I used to think exactly like you, even if it is not the case. So in any kind of verbal conflict or in a disagreement, usually you have never thought like they did, but you just say that, add a bit of acting into your presentation. You just say that to make them, first of all, connect. You make them open their inner ears to listen to what you say, and you say, I used to think like you before, and I was really convinced of that, but one day something changed. I discovered this, and then I completely changed my mind forever. And you pause, you hit a pause. They will just be like that. They will just open their ears wide open, their eyes, they will be really attentive. And then whatever you say is going to be received by their unconscious mind way more strongly. It's going to hit right at the target because you have opened the pathway. If they are constantly ruminating thoughts as you speak, they're not really conscious enough to receive the message you want to transfer into their unconscious mind. Or if you want the even bolder, the boldest way of using that language pattern, instead of saying I used to think like you before, you might even say I'm going to tell you one thing, I'm going to tell you something. After I've been telling you this one thing, you will never think the same way ever. Or after I told you what I'm going to tell you right now, you will change your mind for sure. If that's a bolder way, and this one is less likely to work if you don't already have rapport, or if you are some authority status figure into the perception of the person talking to you. But this one works a lot too. It may not be the best for a very confrontational case, but for something the person is kind of wishy-washy, not really unsure about what you say, like they don't want to not believe, but they're not really believing you neither. This is like a last hit in their face, in their unconscious mind. After I tell you what I'm going to tell you right now, you will never see things the same way ever again. This is really opening their ears, and if there is some rapport, they are going to connect the dots by themselves, because the mind is always very malleable. Nothing is never completely fixated. Things are always changing. Beliefs and perceptions and attitudes about facts and theories are always changing and adapting based on the world that is moving around us. So when people have a fixated, rigid belief, even with that, they may still change, maybe not just with this language pattern, but this is like a last hit that can make them change for good if you have already used some hypnotic language before. And so just after this language pattern, you are going to tell the story you want to tell. And even if it is a completely super simple story, like you just went to eat an apple yesterday, nothing more complex than this, just something, whatever it is, because stories in any case are already bypassing the conscious mind, the conscious barriers way more easily than direct facts. So even without making a complex metaphor, just introducing your story, your metaphor with a statement like that, a language pattern like time distortion language pattern, like after I have been telling you this, you will never see things the same way ever again, stuff like that, they are going to be much more aware of what could be right about what you say. And the last technique, number 3, is to bring back their attention whenever they are starting to be caught by their thoughts, by their random rumination. You just bring back their attention right here and now. So this is especially for highly ADHD people who can never pay attention, they can never stop their trail of thoughts because they are constantly thinking and thinking and talking and talking and talking, and you just never can finish your stories. For those ones, you just leave the loop open. So they have been cutting you in the middle of your story, or they have been interrupting you. Even better, now you have an open loop. You have opened the loop because you have started a story, and it will be a right way of getting back to this story. And when you have been opening a loop into the mind of the person you're talking to, and you go back to that loop later in time by saying, oh, remember what I said 10 minutes ago? I didn't finish my story. So actually what happened with John, and boom, then you say whatever message you want to infuse into your communication. By doing that, you are making their mind connect the dots, and it will bypass their resistance even more easily if it is an open loop like that. So if you are jumping through time, starting a story and finishing it later, when you finish the story there is less resistance because the beginning of the story has already been accepted by their conscious resistance. So if they cut you in the middle, great, take that as an opportunity instead of being pissed off about those people always interrupting you. And you might even cut your own stories by yourself. You may, like Richard Bandler does that all the time with a way more complex methodology, but basically you can even cut your story yourself by jumping into a new hoop and a new loop and a new loop, and you just come back to what you said later. It will help you infuse messages into your stories that will bypass the resistance, because when you just cut your story and jump into a new one and cut your story and jump into a new one, the brain of the person is less and less able to process negation. It is just overwhelming their conscious defenses, and they will be less able to resist what you say and to refute with a counter argument and saying, no, you're wrong because blah, blah, blah. When if you just cut your stories every time you cut them before the inflation point where you're going to say something that might trigger them, you just cut it before and you jump back to it later. That way you just caress all their infuriated conscious resistance and you let them get angry by themselves later. In any case, your message has been going forward. Or if the person, last case scenario, if the person is just not paying attention enough and they're just in their thoughts all the time or not really involved into the discussion, like you tell a story and they don't say anything, which most likely is because they were not paying attention, they were not listening, or that you just hit something very uncomfortable for them and they don't really know how to answer that, you can just infuse some more questions into your discussion, into your communication. Questions like, what do you think about that? Or what about you? If you see that they are not really responsive, they're not really responding, and they are kind of distant in the communication, just use much more the communication tactic. And what do you think about that? By the way, what are your thoughts on that? Oh, could you give me your opinion? Those questions are just forcing their mind to come back into active listening and active participation. The biggest aspect of unconscious communication is to have their attention. At least it is the first entry point. Then there are way more advanced and technical aspects to it. But in the beginning, what you want is to get their mind attentive to what you say, without which most of your message is just going to be ignored. And there is this little debate about, oh yeah, but if you just tell a story, it will just go into subliminals and people will it will just influence people by themselves when they dream. I kind of disagree with that. From my experience, subliminals do work. They do work in terms of affecting your perception, how you think about yourself, how you think about certain matters. They do work, but they are not as effective as when you have the active participation and listening of the person in front of you. Trying to infuse messages into their mind can work, but it's like 50% chances of working. Whereas when you communicate with a strong intent in mind, you really want to persuade them about this one thing, this one belief you want them to change or hold about themselves, and you target their mind, you make them connect, you make them attentive to what you say first before infusing any messages, any unconscious suggestion. It will work way more easily because there is no barrier. Somebody who is not attentive is having barriers surrounding their head. If you make them really attentive, the barriers melt and drop, and then you can just infuse them with whatever you want to say. If you want to learn more about that, I have a book that is in the description on the first link called Covert Hypnosis in Real Life, and there are 2 chapters entirely on storytelling and story practices. How do you make your stories more convincing? How do you create more messages and more clever messages, suggestions into your stories that will just bypass conscious resistance and make people change in the best way?